Hello, I'm Tony Guida. This is My New York. Today, the riveting story of a man named Sandy Wills. He fought a war for this country and was discharged honorably, but the military denied his pension. He's never been recognized as a war hero. He's buried in an unmarked grave. All because Sandy Wills was a slave. His service was in the Civil War. Fortunately, though, his great-great-great-granddaughter is a journalist. She is Cheryl Wills, veteran anchor of New York 1 News. Over the past 10 years, Cheryl has uncovered the tragic story of her ancestor and is still fighting to see that he gets justice. The Sandy Wills story, next. Cheryl Wills, it is good to see you.
Tony,
welcome.
Thank you. You know, I have admired you for years. Seriously.
Thank you.
You are an inspiration to me as a journalist.
Well, thank you. That's very kind.
Thank you for having me.
You're a veteran journalist, 25 years on New York 1, and I don't think I'm going to be taking a big leap off a ledge here by assuming that this story, the story of your great-great-great-grandfather, is the biggest scoop you've ever had.
No doubt about it. And Tony, what really bothers me is that when I was a kid in school, I was learning about Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, all of the Confederates, not a word about the 180,000 black soldiers who fought in Lincoln's army.
I never learned that either.
Exactly. Most people don't. Lincoln's army was struggling midway through that war. And when the black soldiers came on starting in 1863, which my grandpa Sandy was in that number, they helped strengthen the army and helped power the Union to victory.
Well, it was called the U.S. Colored Troops,
Right,
wasn't it?
right.
And that's what he joined. But how did you discover this story?
You know, it all started out actually, it started with a tragedy. My father got killed when I was a kid on his motorcycle. He was a fireman at Engine 1 in Midtown. And at that moment, I was like, who are we?
You were 13 years old.
I was 13 years old, Tony. And I noticed on his obituary, it said, Clarence Wills was born in Haywood County, Tennessee. And I'm like, where is that? He never talked about it. Who's the family he left behind? My grandparents are from there. Everyone's acting like they're a born and bred New Yorker. I was the first generation New Yorker, but my family was from Haywood County. At that moment, I went on a search just in my mind because there was no internet then. Who are the Willses? Where did we get this name from? And then literally 30 years later, you know, you never let go of a death like that at 13.
Yeah.
When you lose someone like that, you never let it go. So in my mind, I was like, what happened? Where was my father born? And who are the people? And, you know, a lot of black people are told, oh, your ancestors were slaves. What were their names? We don't know. That bothered me. Well, they didn't have, right, they didn't have names. They didn't have stories. So fast forward 30 years later, here's Ancestry.com. I start poking around, boom. Found Sandy Wills, hired a professional genealogist because I'm a journalist and you know, Tony, we got to get it right. I hired a genealogist. I was like, is this really my blood ancestor? He was like, not only is he your blood, he married a woman named Emma. She filed pension documents as a widow and told the whole story of your family. Went to the National Archives, got everything, blew my mind.
So you learn that this man, after the Emancipation Proclamation by, of course, President Lincoln,
right.
He's now a free man,
right.
But he joins the Union Army,
right.
1863?
October of 1863, and he escaped with 5 men that he grew up with as boys on Edmund Wills's plantation. So what I really enjoy telling people is that I even know who gave him his name. I'm the first in my family, Tony, to crack that code. We've been walking around with a slave owner's name and no one knew who he was. His name was Edmund Wills, and he bought my grandfather when he was 10 years old from Tipton County, Tennessee.
He bought him.
He literally bought him. And I call that an exclusive. Don't we call that in our business an exclusive? I got the exclusive in my family.
Yeah. But it's interesting when he enlists.
Yeah.
You sent me the documents,
Yeah.
you know, his enlistment.
Yeah.
He puts down his profession or occupation.
Right.
The other guys who went in the Army with him, who escaped from that plantation.
Right. They all escaped together.
Yeah, all put down slave as their profession, their occupation. And he put?
Farmer. But I want to just clarify one thing. They didn't write anything because they were forced into illiteracy. That's something I always remind people. They were unable to read or write. It was illegal to teach slaves English, to teach them how to read or write. So they didn't know anything about punctuation or anything like that. So the officers filled out their forms. And one by one, they put occupation slave, occupation slave. When it got to my grandpa, I don't know what he said, Tony, but the same man signed it off and he wrote farmer. That meant everything to me.
Why?
Because that meant my grandpa said, hold it. I don't know what you think you're doing, but I'm not anyone's slave as of this moment. That's empowerment. And when people think of enslaved people, they do not think of empowered people. They think of weak people. And my grandfather was empowered. And he took a step in defining himself when the world had painted him with this broad brush called slave all of his life. And the moment he had his chance, he took it. That is the greatest gift to me, Tony, that I will carry to my grave. That my grandfather set freedom in motion October 13th, 1863.
Well, and of course had helped set freedom in motion by fighting for the Union side in the war, which was a campaign against slavery, among other things.
Yeah.
Your research has been, you're indomitable. I mean, you are just not, there isn't anybody going to stand in your way of learning this whole story, and you're still at it. And I was fascinated to learn that you not only know this history you've been talking about, but you even know where he's buried in Tennessee.
I think I know.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so we are literally in the process of unraveling that mystery. Listen, Tony, I was so happy when I found out his story, and especially through his wife who gave the oral depositions. I figured, okay. I did a search in the cemeteries, the military cemeteries and the local cemeteries in Haywood County, Tennessee. Nothing. I sent people to go headstone by headstone in every cemetery. No sign of Sandy Wills. We think we may have found him. And when I make the confirmation, I'm going to come back and give you another story that's going to knock your socks off. Because I'm going to have to use ground penetrating radar to dig in an area where I think he is. There is a plot on the plantation where he last lived, and we have a feeling he's there.
And you told me it was a routine, if you can call it that, among slaves who, of course, when any of their number were died on a plantation or were buried on a plantation, there was never any marker.
Right.
But they planted, what is it?
They would plant a flower called periwinkle. It comes back every year without fail. And there's a little plot on the cemetery, on the plantation where he died, and it's covered in periwinkle. So that's kind of where I am now, unraveling that mystery, and I'll keep you posted. And
the ultimately your effort, as you've told me and that you've written about, is to have him recognized as a hero.
Absolutely.
And therefore to be buried at Arlington. Disinterment, if you can find.
If we do the DNA and it matches, I'm pretty confident we're headed in that direction. You know, I don't care about Arlington. I would probably want him to be in a military cemetery in Tennessee, his home state.
Okay.
But I certainly want him to get the funeral with honors that was due him in February of 1889 before he was dumped in a mass grave. That is unfair. And it happened to thousands of black soldiers who served in the Civil War. They're finding them all over the South. And it is a real national tragedy. And they're not alone. They're with their families. Many of them died dirt poor, not because they were lazy, not because they were not working. They were sharecroppers, but very often they were cheated out of their fair share of the crop, and they died penniless. My grandmother remarked in an oral deposition, my husband, Sandy Wills, left me nothing except one horse. You know what I called my production company? One Horse Films.
Good for you. Since we're talking about her, Emma was her name?
Emma Wills.
As you point out, your grandfather, as you call him, and Emma.
Right.
I mean, it's, you know, I don't want to keep saying great-great-great.
Right. I call him Grandpa Sandy, Grandma Emma.
Both illiterate, as you point out, and at the beginning of the program, I mentioned the military denied his pension to Emma after he died.
Right.
And
she had to fight for it. She had to hire a lawyer.
She fought like hell.
She really did. And she had 9 dependent children. And the government came at her and they were basically like, look, you could tell the bureaucracy was born in the 19th century because they were basically like, look, you can't prove to us your identity. You were a former slave. You could be anyone claiming to be the widow of Sandy Wills. How do we know you had those 9 children by him? You could have slept with 10 men, and now you find out this soldier's dead, and now you want to be Emma Wills? And she was very cool. She said, I had my former owner's son write in my Bible every single time one of my children was born. From the first to the last, he documented the first and last name and the birth date. She got Joel Moore, who she was referencing, to file an affidavit on her behalf, and after a lot of back and forth and legal wrangling, they paid her.
Wow.
Tony, I would have loved to know that when I was in 9th grade. I would have loved to know that that kind of tenacity was in me. Kids need to know who's in their family tree and where their strength is. She was a powerful woman, and she was put in a grave with no marker, as if she had never existed. Like
Grandpa.
Like Sandy. Grandpa Sandy.
Have you been to this part of Tennessee?
I have. I went for the first time with public television this past summer. Oh. And we are on a journey to find them. I didn't know this was going to happen, but I'm not going to rest. I am going to find them, and I'm going to give them the burial they deserve. There should be a marker that says Sandy Wills, Private United States Colored Troops, with his birthday, so his descendants can go and lay flowers and salute his service. When I was in the South, I couldn't go 100 yards without seeing Confederate memorials everywhere. These were rebels that tried to destroy the country, okay? Yeah. And there's memorials to them. I don't disrespect them because I don't believe in disrespecting soldiers of any stripe, but let's be clear about their mission. They wanted slavery forever. And you can't go 2 blocks without seeing a soaring memorial to them. And my grandfather, who helped break the shackles of slavery, not only for his family, but for this entire country, he's a ghost.
So your feeling about this current controversy with memorials of Southern, former Confederate leaders, and now it's spread to people like Columbus and everything else. Your feeling about at least the Confederate monuments is what? Take them down?
They belong in a museum. Let's be clear. All over the South, just like there are descendants of Union soldiers, there are also descendants of Confederate soldiers. We can't pretend their history is irrelevant. For them, it's very relevant. And we have freedom of speech in this country. I respect freedom of speech. If it wasn't for freedom of speech, I wouldn't be a journalist, right? So I don't believe in trampling on anyone's rights. However, when it comes to public property, those monuments, which to me stand in defense of slavery, should be taken down. Put them privately in your museum, put them in your home, sleep with them. I don't care. But if my taxpayer dollars have anything to do with it, I don't think a nickel of my money should go to a monument that is basically saying slavery forever and we're willing to die for it. That's what the Confederacy means to me. So I have an issue with it, as do many other Americans of all backgrounds. And the debate, Tony, shows that there's a huge misunderstanding about this period. Charlottesville, people are confused. You're fighting over, do you even know what Robert E. Lee was fighting for? Robert E. Lee himself did not endorse all of these monuments. This was clearly a weapon of people who wanted to further Jim Crow, who wanted to further discrimination and tear down innocent Americans, prevent them from voting, intimidate them, and let them know the South will rise again. And you know what that means when we rise again. So let's be real clear about what these statues represent. So I really believe they should be in museums, private property, do what you want, but when it comes to public view, I disagree.
And obviously you would disagree with that. There are some who are saying, okay, leave them there, but put plaques explaining some of the history, you know, so people is not just looking at, let's say, Lee on a horse, but there's something written there that puts him and why that's there in context. You say no.
I don't see it that way. He tore this country apart. He hurt this country. And if you go to Germany, you're not going to find statues of Nazi soldiers with plaques. They are forbidden. The Nazi flag is illegal in Germany. They didn't do anything to help Germany. The Confederates didn't do anything to help the United States of America. So I know there are some people who will vehemently disagree with that. I beg to differ as a descendant of a member of the United States Colored Troops. I don't need to see a soaring monument of someone who hated people who were enslaved and thought God told him that they should be enslaved forever. This is what was going on. These Confederate soldiers wanted slavery forever, and they used the Bible, they used the Constitution to say they were 3/5 of a human being. I mean, some really terrible things happened here. Innocent children were sold away from their parents. All of the chaos you see now stems from the plantations. So yeah, I'm not a proponent of a memorial in public view.
I'm going to ask you one more question about this, but then we'll leave it. I don't want to get back to the Sandy Wills story. Washington, Jefferson, they had
all
slaves.
Slave owners, yeah.
So what about their monument?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I say this, if we start to parse the history of every single person in America, from Washington to Dr. King to everyone, you're going to have a problem, because everyone has issues, shall we say. Everyone did something that we look at and go, ooh, you know, you founded the country, you signed the Declaration of Independence, but you probably shouldn't have been owning human beings while you talked about freedom. But I think that they, as the founding fathers, and all people who do great things, there has to be an exception. But the Confederates had one motive: to destroy the United States of America, create their own country, and keep slavery forever. Right. There was no redeeming value in any of that. They didn't, the founding of the Confederacy was not benevolent in any way to a great many people. So that's how I see it. George Washington, Jefferson, slavery was as American as apple pie in their view.
I want to quote something you wrote in, I forget which book it is, and you can tell me. This is when you're around 13, your father has died recklessly in a motorcycle accident. He's only 38. And you're searching, first of all, you're completely broken up. I mean, it's like
devastated. 13 years old, going through puberty.
Devastated is the word I was looking for.
Puberty and grief.
And there was another grandpa, just a regular grandpa, who you had a lot to do with, and he was Grandpa Fred.
Right.
And somewhere in this period, he's dying. Yeah. And he tells you, I guess we weren't meant to have nothing.
Yeah. And
in the context that you put that, a 13-year-old girl hearing that and devastated by her father's death and wondering about the stuff going on around her.
Right.
It was, give our audience a sense of the context of that for you.
You know, my grandfather, Fred, was a storefront preacher in Astoria, Queens, right? And he brought the Tennessee Delta blues with him to New York, and he sang in church, and he became my surrogate father after my dad died. And in 1997, when he died, you know, I was working at New York One, and I was stunned that he said that. He flopped down on the couch. He had been diagnosed with a fatal lung cancer. And you could tell he had resigned. I guess we weren't meant to have nothing. Translation for me, he had all these dreams, and he didn't get to see them come true. And what struck me, Tony, was that he said, we. So he was kind of saying, all of us are going to get,
you're going to get nothing.
Right, we're all going to get nothing. And it was an interesting choice of a pronoun that he used. He didn't say, I wasn't going to, he said all of us, because we were all looking at him, you know, grief-stricken, knowing that he had weeks to live. And he was Sandy Wills's great-grandson, and he didn't even know it. He didn't know the heroism in him. He didn't know the legacy that he came from, nothing. He just knew that he was still dirt poor, like he was in Tennessee. And I think that, Tony, is why I'm so driven to redeem all of my grandfathers. I want to let them know we are not meant to have anything. Yeah. And I'm going to show you. And so I think most people have that for their own legacies. We all want to show our grandparents, look, Grandma, I know you came here with very little money, but I'm going to do it for you. And you could see your grandparents, when they see you make it big, they're like, we're so glad you made it. I think that's a common American trait there, you know? Everyone wants their children to do better. So that's why I work so hard. Some people say, why do you go to schools? Why do you write all of these books? And I'm like, I'm doing it for every grandfather I ever had.
Well, let's talk about that. I want to talk about, you take this story, a lecture, if I can call it that, yeah, around to schools, not just here in the city, but around the country. You've been to Nevada, you've been to Boston, you've been to Chicago, you've been everywhere. Talk about the books. Now, you wrote, at least one is aimed at children.
Yes, that's actually my favorite. The Emancipation of Grandpa Sandy Wills is a picture book, and it's a nice big book, which I wish I had when I was a kid. And I do what I do every day. I interview my Grandpa Sandy. I have a dream that I meet him, Tony, and he's in my newsroom, and I'm like, since you're here, can I interview you about your life? And I take readers on a journey, because most kids, when you talk about slavery, they can't even picture it. They're like, what? So I show him on the auction block. I show him in the field picking cotton from sunup to sundown. I show him on the battlefield during the Civil War. A lot of kids can't picture this. So it was an honor to present the book in that format. I also have another book called Emancipated, My Family's Fight for Freedom, and that's for older students, middle school, high school. And now I'm talking to you more as the broken teenage kid that had the wind blown just a little more, you wouldn't know who I was, because I would have wrecked my life. I really say it was my mom and my grandparents who steered me, because you don't know how to process some tragedy like your father dying at 13. You can eat, some clown can come up to you and say, hey, baby, I love you, have my baby. You're like, okay, you remind me of my father. And next thing you know, your life is ruined, you know? I came that close to making that mistake. That's why I have such empathy for people who make mistakes in their youth. It's very easy when you're broken, and I was broken as a kid. So when I go to schools, I bare my soul. I say, look, I grew up in the projects. My father walked away from us, and then he died. And I saw the whole thing happen in real time. And I wasn't mature enough to process it. And I felt like I wanted to go join him. But I hung in there, and now I want you, students, to hang in there. What happened to you doesn't mean that that has to infiltrate your soul. It just happened. You can overcome it. Some people can come, some people can go, but you gotta keep going straight.
And what kind of reaction do you, well, I can imagine the reaction you get. The places you go and the culture you're addressing, well, let me put it this way. A lot of young people getting themselves in trouble, whether they're African American or Hispanic or white or, you know, whatever. And there's so much surrounding these kids that is leading them astray. There's drugs, there's all kinds of...
It was surrounding me as well.
And what about the culture? What about the music? What about words like the N-word that is so common in rap music? And, you know, I don't mean for this to sound like I'm only addressing the issues of African-American kids, but, you know, you have very strong feelings about what these kids should know versus what they're learning or what they're exposed to. So I wonder what you think of that.
Well, when I grew up in New York City, rap was born in the 70s, right? And they weren't calling us B's and N-words and all this. It was a fun, empowering music, you know, reflecting what's happening on the streets. And it was really a time for artists to say, look, this is what's happening. And we loved it, with a great rhythm, with a great beat. It took a turn and became profane in some, not all rap music, but some artists became very profane, and the use of the N-word and the B-word and all kinds of profanity. And you know what? You have a right to express that as well, but children are listening to this because they too love the rhythm. The rhythm is, as they say, dope. So what do you do when kids fall in love with your song and they're calling each other the N-word all day long? So I incorporate that into my talks. And when I talk about Grandpa Sandy, I put him up on a screen and I say, they called him that word all day long. And I assure you, there was no music behind it. And I promise you, he was hurt by it.
Cheryl Wills, it is a remarkable story. It is a continuing story. And you have the invitation open to be back here as you learn more and maybe finish this quest to have justice for him.
I can't wait to come back and tell you. And
Grandma Emma, too.
Yes, yes.
Because I think what you're talking about is American history.
100%.
Not black history. It's American history.
Red, white, and blue, all American history, apple pie, you name it. You cannot talk about America if you don't understand the Civil War.
I so look forward to having you back here. Cheryl, thank you.
Tony, thank you.
And we hope to see you next time.